another presenter. We don't know what's happening with her. But this is intergenerational projects based on family history. And I've been working on these projects for several years. And the young people with me today have put together their own projects under my guidance. And they'll tell you about their work later. Okay, my own projects developed from visits and conversations with family and friends throughout central Illinois, many of whom were living in isolated situations or who were ill. I found the conversations about the past made them happy, because for many of them, youth seemed to be a time in which they were secure and in control. And I learned a lot, too, about farming in the 1920s, bridge parties in the 1930s, and amateur dramatics in the 1940s. And as a teacher, I also became interested in using other forms of stimuli. For many of these people were withdrawn, and they needed to be encouraged to express themselves. The materials that I drew on included photographs, music, books, films, and paintings, and again based on the past interests and experiences of the people I knew. Now, everybody has family photos on bedside tables, on desktops, and these photos can readily set off chains of memory. One woman had a portrait of herself as a child wearing a fancy white dress and a big white bow in her hair. And when we began to talk about the picture, she remembered not only the occasion, but the location of the studio, which was on the second floor of a building overlooking the river. Musical films were popular at a nursing home in southwestern Illinois, especially Jerome Kern's Showboat. For these were people who lived between the Mississippi and the Illinois rivers, and the residents would clap their hands in time to the music and would sing too. One resident, in fact, had been a professional singer, but she responded positively not only to music, but to color. A scene in an early 1950s movie called Deep in My Heart, which is about the life of Sigmund Romberg, had a room decorated entirely in purple. She usually couldn't speak coherently because she was in the final stages of Alzheimer's. But after watching the sequence, she turned to me and said clearly, "Purple is a beautiful color." Another female resident of the same home who was a stroke patient spoke hardly at all. But when I showed her paintings by Mary Cassatt of a mother and a baby, and Grant Wood of a farm scene, she was able to identify their situations clearly, albeit in a soft voice. A male stroke patient in a small city in central Illinois responded positively to selections from Tom Sawyer that were read to him, particularly the sequence in which Tom and Becky were exploring the cave, because he remembered exploring caves himself in eastern Illinois when he was a boy, and how unpleasant they could be with bugs and water. Reading is the most effective device, especially using familiar selections like The Night Before Christmas and The Lord's Prayer. I was in an Alzheimer's unit a few years ago, reading The Night Before Christmas to a small group of people, when a woman sitting hunched in a corner, apparently oblivious to what was going on, began to repeat the words after me, which was the most moving experience. I also make considerable use of children's picture books because of their format, the colorful pictures, the large print, and the frequent use of classic stories and also familiar settings. I used Jim Aylesworth's Folks in the Valley, with striking illustrations by Stefano Vitale, about Amish farm life with an Alzheimer's patient for several years, because she could sound out the words after me because of the large print, even though she couldn't put complete sentences together. I also liked stories by Cynthia Rylant and Barbara Cooney. Picture books are a world unto themselves, and they're definitely not just for children. The activity director at the home in southwestern Illinois has a female resident who's been writing poetry from childhood on, and asked me to help her compose some poems for a contest. And so I did. She dictated them, and I wrote them down. The subjects based on her childhood, and they were entered in the contest and in other contests too, including the contest sponsored by the ASA and the MCOA here today. And Marissa will read one of these poems to you.
I used to rock the babies to sleep, even when I was real small. There were 10 of us. I was the oldest girl. All my sisters were younger, and one brother. Mother nursed them, washed them. Later, I'd wash them too, in a dishpan with warm water. let them splash around. They enjoyed that. I'd sit in the wicker rocking chair. Mother would put them in my lap. I'd pat them. They liked to be patted. I'd sing too. I couldn't carry a tune, just make noise. They didn't worry about it. Always one or two slept with me. Cuddled up, so peaceful.
Thank you. After this, I became interested in using poetry as a means of self-expression, and I organized other groups and other residences. Simple subjects were chosen: the seasons, holidays, school, and I did short poems, rhymed and unrhymed, also on everyday life, as models by authors like Carl Sandburg and Christina Rossetti. Reading them first, then letting the participants use them to develop their own ideas. And Jake will read one of these poems to you by a male participant.
I was in high school, 16 years old, in Springfield. My English teacher was a spinster. She wore bloomers halfway down to her ankles. You knew you'd been to class when you had her. She could ferret those out who weren't paying attention. She was a dynamic teacher. Everybody loved her.
And these poems are on display on the river level, the River Cafe level of the Sheraton Hotel, which I'm very pleased about, with poetry and the photography competition. So they're on the bulletin board if you have time to go over and take a look at them more closely. So I'm very happy about that. When I had the opportunity to go to Massachusetts to accept an appointment at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I decided to develop this work as a research project, involving not just adults like myself, but young people too, for it to be an invaluable opportunity for them, not only to learn firsthand about life during the early 20th century, but how to interact with older people in sometimes critical situations. So for almost 2 years, I met twice a month with 4 young people from a Boston area middle school, ranging in age from 11 to 14, and 4 nursing home residents, ranging in age from their 50s to their 80s, composing stories from past experiences. Again, simple subjects were chosen: food, pets, hobbies, the young people reading their own versions first, which they'd written in their English classes, and then transcribing those to the residents, because only one woman could do her own writing. It was rewarding to see how both residents and young people grew in confidence and writing ability during that time. For miraculously, I had the same residents for the whole 2-year period, and 3 of the young people. Most of the young people were in their final year of middle school, so they graduated along the way. And Jake and Jesse will read stories by a young boy and a female resident who worked together during this time to show the development of their writing ability and their use of detail. And the topics are food and hobbies.
My dad is a real good carpenter. He is always making new things. When I was young, I would collect little action figures. My dad would make little houses for them out of wood. He made little doors in the houses. He made one house for the good guys and one house for the bad guys.
My favorite hobby was reading. My favorite books were the Reader's Digest and love stories. They were very interesting to me. I like to read different kinds of children's books too. My favorite was Goldilocks. I also like to read books about different countries like China and Japan.
My favorite food is lobster with melted butter. It's real expensive, so I can't have it a lot. My dad always wants to get it, and so do I, but my mom always says, no, it's too much money. I think it is so much money because there are not many lobsters and they are hard to catch. I like melted butter because it gives lobsters lots of taste. My grandmother makes something called lobster sauce that has tomato sauce in it and spaghetti. She only makes it once a year on special occasion, and she chooses which one.
I like spaghetti and meatballs. We'd sit by the table and make it ourselves. We learned how to do it from a cousin who was Italian. We first made the meatballs separately, rolling the meat to little balls and then putting in the sauce. We used canned tomatoes with oil, garlic, and onions for the sauce. Then the meatballs simmered on the stove in the sauce. My parents really liked beef, so we also had corned beef and stew. And Chinese food on Sunday night. We had hot dogs in the park, or beef with potato salad, lettuce, tomatoes, and fruit punch tomato sauce.
There were other joint activities too. There were field trips to museums and historic sites, music sessions, and film viewing. At the Fogg Museum in Cambridge, one resident compared a painting of a richly dressed Dutch family from the 17th century to her own family. We always put on nice clothes on Sunday, she said. I wish people would still do that today. At the Parker House Hotel in downtown Boston, we watched Boston cream pie and Parker House rolls being made, and we sampled them too. They're real things, said one male resident, not just the supermarket kind. He also told us about life in the nearby Dockland area of Boston because he had once worked there when he was young. I also want to comment on the helpfulness of the people who worked at these facilities because these are facilities with international reputation. They treated our small group, some in wheelchairs, as honored guests, and the head chef himself demonstrated his cooking skills before us in the kitchen. We used musical selections with our group sessions as well. When I played Brother Can You Spare a Dime, a Depression-era song with the message implicit in the title, one of the young boys compared the situation in the song to that of the street people of today. For as I said before, the sessions were also intended to be learning experiences for the young people. Movies and their performers were as important in Boston as in Illinois, Shirley Temple in particular, to those who grew up during the Depression. When I showed her movies to two people from totally different backgrounds, an Eastern Illinois farmer who had not completed his grade school work, and a Radcliffe graduate from a Boston suburb, both were moved to tears when she appeared on the screen. This was very interesting to me. She really was important at that time to a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. Movies and their performers very often have intergenerational connections too. I wanted to show an Our Gang movie to my Boston group, but one of the young boys had a Charlie Chaplin movie that he liked a lot. So I let him show it instead. And all of us watched Modern Times and enjoyed it very much, even though it's almost 70 years old. The timeless appeal of performers like these, and I think you can think of other favorites like Fred Astaire or Marilyn Monroe, or name the Three Stooges. I think you like the Three Stooges. Okay, good. And you can use these movies and their performers as taking off points for family discussions as well. I have an interesting story to tell about the Eastern Illinois farmer. He met with a junior high school student on a weekly basis for one semester, sharing his life experiences with him. In the middle of the semester, he had a stroke, but he and the girl continued to meet anyway. And the girl was given the option of continuing or not continuing with the project, because she was only 13 at the time, but she chose to stay with it. And I remember she was sitting by his bedside once, and he was in a lot of pain, and he said he really felt like shooting himself. But she was able to deal with this situation. She dealt with it very well. As a result, she received a community service award from her school at the end of the semester, and he received honorary grade school and high school diplomas from the regional superintendent, complete with media coverage, and we were very, very happy, all of us, obviously. When I came back to Illinois, I also began to focus on the history of my own family, with the encouragement of my sister, a project I had begun years earlier and had put aside. I drew on memories of family and friends, my sister, a cousin, a teacher, a school friend, again, various ages and backgrounds, that I obtained by letter, by telephone, and in person. And we focused on our childhood, the games we played, the trips we took, the house we lived in, the books we read. And these vignettes of family life were then enhanced by photographic material from family sources and from relevant books, magazines, newspapers, postcards, and even sheet music. I'm surprised we didn't think of doing this earlier, as my grandfather and father were both photographers, and my mother a retoucher and a photo colorist. I made particular use of women's and children's magazines and school textbooks, too, because of their extensive use of color pictures and black and white pictures as well. Some of the material came from the local public library, not only their holdings, but their interlibrary loan service. But near the library were several antique and used bookstores, and here I found other items to be photographed. A Latin book and a Bob Beekman book I'd read when I was a child, dessert dishes similar to those my mother had, and storybook dolls resembling those my sister had collected. And I bought them. I also went to antique shows and to postcard shows, the latter furnishing a wealth of material as well. From my father's picture of my father's university in Michigan during World War I to Ellis Island in the 1920s when my mother landed there. And all of this material was then scanned onto a computer. And the images and text juxtaposed on the screen in a variety of ways until a final version or versions was decided on. And I did this with the help of graphic design students. But the design process itself also has intergenerational elements, as I work with students in their early 20s, but with a far better knowledge of computer graphics than I could ever have. Yet despite differences in language and dress, a mutual excitement still exists over the blending of text and image. And this is something that can be done again by family members as well, of different ages. The results of the design process are sometimes startling. Not long ago, I was working on a story about my parents' courtship, using 2 photographs taken by my father, a postcard, and a piece of sheet music. The designer and I arranged and rearranged the material when suddenly she gasped. Because there they were, my parents, when they were young and when they were in love. And by doing this, I've been able to understand my own family better, building a portrait of their lives and of an era that is long past. For this is what all of us have been doing, not only recording the history of our own families, for ourselves, but for posterity. For much of this material can be used not only in family files, but in community and state archives, which is what I'm doing with my own material. And I'd like to have Jessie and Marissa read 2 stories written by my sister and myself, and Jessie will begin with my sister's story. Can you move up a little bit to the front? I should say over here, Jessie. Can you hear her all right, you think? Pretty good.
One day, I was playing in the backyard, and all of a sudden, I saw a bunny jump away. I watched her go. I knew I'd never catch up with her. And then I looked where she'd been sitting and found a little covering of hair on the ground, her hair. So I pulled it out, and beneath it were these tiny little bunnies, brand new, white and gray, and no bigger than my thumb. I ran into the house calling for my sister, and she came back with me and said, "No, don't touch them. The mom won't come back if you do." As we watched them, we felt the mother's presence, so we covered them up again. When we looked out the back window of our house later, they were gone. It was such a wonderful discovery. It meant a lot to me. It will never go away. I'll always keep it in my mind and heart.
Patsy had an island. No one could come there, only her friend John, and me sometimes. We'd bicycle there. It was in the middle of a stream, covered with trees and bushes. She made a cave of bushes to crawl inside and listen to birds singing above. She built a bridge, too, a bridge across the water. The water wasn't very deep. She even made a map, her own private island. She also liked reading books about the island. Some of her favorites were Treasure Island, Floating Island, and Mystery Island.
How do I find the young people that I work with and the older people too? As I said earlier, many of the older people I've known from childhood. My advisor at Harvard had a former student who was a middle school principal, and he in turn recommended a nursing home that had connections with his school. I also wanted to work with a patient who had memory problems, so I found an additional home myself in a nearby suburb, simply by making a lot of telephone calls. A girls' school and a boys' school were nearby, so I contacted teachers at each, but none of the girls were interested. But I did find 2 boys at the boys' school, and they came over to the home periodically to read Latin and French with the resident, who had been a language teacher. Before I came back to Illinois, the school gave me a Latin book, where I became interested in Latin again too, having studied it in high school many years ago. When I was visiting a nursing home in my own area of Illinois, I found that one of the residents was a former Latin teacher from my own high school. So we've been reading Latin together for 3 years now. We finished the one book twice, and we're partway through the other one, the one that I found in the antique shop. And last weekend, just before I came here, we were reading about Aeneas and Lavinia, and she is now 102 years old. I found the junior high school student by contacting a history teacher at her school in central Illinois. 10 students, all girls, responded to the teacher's email. Here you have the opposite of what you had in Boston, all girls and all boys. 4 finally began the project, but only 1 continued to the semester's end, and she was the one who received the Community Service Award. It's not easy to locate interested people and to keep them interested. So I appreciate the efforts and work of the young people here today and their families, because family support is vital. I also want to talk briefly about the therapeutic aspects of this work. It can be comforting and reassuring to go into the past and remember and record pleasant experiences. For it can give people a feeling of importance and pride, especially at a time when they might need it. And sometimes they need it desperately. For many of the people I have worked with were critically ill and are now gone. And this is why the stories we write are generally upbeat. For many times, the context in which they are written is not. Indeed, I next intend to focus on families in crisis using projects like this. The young people who have come here today have been working on similar projects with their own families, and they're going to share this work with you and tell you what it has meant to them. Some have Chicago connections, too. I'll have them introduce themselves to you, and I'm very proud of all of them. Jessie, I think you're going to go first. Why don't you stand down here that way? Could you hear them okay? Okay, fine.
I'm Jessie Swike. I'm 11 years old, and I live in Bloomington, Illinois. And I'd like to share a story about my grandparents with you today. My Jaja and Pusha, Edward and Sally Swike, are first-generation Polish Americans. All my great-grandparents immigrated from Poland and traveled to Chicago in the early 1900s. Jaja and Pusha's first language was Polish. Jaja was next to youngest of 9 children. He grew up during the Great Depression. His family lived in a Polish neighborhood on the near north side of Chicago on Chicago Avenue. These are some of his childhood memories. My Pusha, Sally Made, had 3 older brothers in her family. She grew up in the same neighborhood as Jaja, but she lived on Marshall. As children, she and Jaja were members of the same church and attended the same grade school. These are her childhood memories. Although they grew up in the same neighborhood, Pusha and Jaja didn't get to know each other until they were adults. My grandparents have always lived in Chicago, and my family lives in Bloomington. I have talked with them during family visits and on the phone for these stories. I selected my favorite stories about their daily life, meals, and entertainment. Jaja remembers that his family certainly didn't eat balanced meals. A typical lunch was lard on rye bread. The most exciting thing was watching his mom make a kowach, a huge round egg and raisin bread. In the winter, the dough was placed under clean bed sheets and feather tipped to rise, and then baked in the coal-burning stove. They could not eat it until after Sunday church. What a treat. Sunday was chicken soup day with the chicken dissected so that everyone got a little bitty piece with boiled potatoes and carrots and sauerkraut. They seldom had meat. They just simply couldn't afford it. I felt really bad for Jaja when I learned that all his family could afford to eat was animal fat on bread, because compared to the hot dogs and salads and pizza and all the stuff we have today, I think we're a lot better off. Jaja's family owned a candy store. Owning a candy store with penny candy and ice cream sounds like a dream, but it depended on who was minding the store. The neighborhood kids used to love to come when Big John, a great-grandfather who was tall, worked behind the counter, because he was more generous with the candy in jumbo ice cream scoops. A roll of candy cost a penny, and he would give the kids 2 for a penny. He would give them 2 scoops of ice cream when they paid for 1. My great-grandmother was the businessman, but great-granddad was a softie. He died when Jaja was 6.5 years old. They sold the candy store shortly after he passed away. If we owned a candy store, I probably wouldn't like candy as much because I'd be sick of hearing about it. Of course, that's saying something right there. I also felt bad to know that Jaja's dad died when he was really little. His mom must have had a really hard time raising 9 kids during the Depression without a 2-person income. When Jaja was little, no one locked doors. The bikes and toys were left on the sidewalk or yard with no thought of anyone stealing. Windows were kept open in the summer. They didn't know what air conditioning was, so summers were unbearable at times. They would sleep on the back porch or even go to the lakefront of Lake Michigan at night with no fear, just to keep cool. Lucia said she didn't know her family was poor when she was little, even though she was aware that other kids had nicer things. There was one dress to wear to school, which my great-grandmother had to keep ironing and washing, and another for Sunday mass only. Of course, there were the usual long brown stockings. Lucia's shoes frequently had holes in the bottom, so great-grandfather would fix thick cardboard inside the shoes to keep her feet dry. She felt inches taller. Great-grandfather taught himself how to sole shoes, and they lasted longer. Busha recalled one Christmas Eve when there was a loud knock on the door. When they answered it, there wasn't anyone there except for a large basket filled with food delivered by a member of the St. Vincent de Paul. There was a new pair of shoes for Busha, and a dress and slip and warm coat. She felt like a princess, and even guilty with these new clothes. When I heard Busha's story, I felt pretty bad for her because I realized that she only had 2 pairs of clothes, and I mean, that was it. And most people today have an entire wardrobe, several pairs of shoes, a couple pairs of jeans, and that was all she had. And I felt really sad to hear that. Jaja loved escaping to the movies. 15 cents for adults before 6:30 in the evening, and 25 cents in the evening with free dishes once a week for the ladies. The kids paid a nickel for a movie and several cereal features, like The Masked Marvel, The Lone Ranger, and Flash Gordon. What a bargain! Busha's treat was a 2-cent ice cream cone at his candy store, of course with a loaf of bread costing 10 cents. A cone took several slices out of their mouths. If they were really lucky, someone treated them to a day at Riverview with Aladdin's Castle or Bob's and Shoots, the roller coasters. They loved listening to the radio, especially Sunday night with Amos and Andy, Jack Benny, and many others. Today, I like going to the movies, even the old ones. And if they cost a nickel, I'd go a lot more often. I like ice cream too. If Gene's, my favorite ice cream place, sold a cone for 2 cents, I'd go every day in the summer. Just think, for $1, you could buy 50 cones of ice cream. That'd keep you busy for a while. I could give one to every single person on my block, with several to spare for myself. I'm lucky enough to have my Busha and Jaja here with me today. Please help me welcome.
Jake will be back. And he's got a...
Hi, my name is Jake Corley, and I'm a 14-year-old 8th grader and live on a farm near Bloomington, Illinois. I'm going to tell you some stories about my grandfather. My grandfather's parents were born in different regions of Finland and each emigrated to Detroit in the early 1900s, as there were more opportunities here for them than in Finland at that time. After they met, they each moved to DeKalb, Illinois, where they eventually married and started their families. My grandfather Raymond was born in 1931 on their house on Pleasant Street. 18 months later, his sister, my great-aunt Violet, was born. I find it interesting that they had a brother born earlier who had died in a drowning accident while playing hockey on a lake. He was named Aino, Finnish name. When my grandpa and his sister were born soon after, Grandpa might have been born to take his place. They were American names. My grandpa doesn't know why, but probably because the family's becoming more Americanized by then. Still, when my grandpa started school, he had a very hard time since he only spoke Finnish. For that reason, he had to repeat kindergarten. Many of the people who lived in DeKalb at that time were from Finland and all worked in the steel mill there. Family, friends, and church were important, for the Finnish community was strong, and Finnish was spoken there. By the time Grandpa was 8, he and his family moved to Waukegan, Illinois. Many of their friends moved as well, as a new steel mill had been built in the city, and they all had the necessary skills to work there. That was where Grandpa grew up and lived for most of his life until recently. Now, he and my grandma live in Bloomington, so they can be closer to my family. It has been good to have them closer to us, because now I can talk to them a lot more often and have a chance to get to know them well. We see them all the time, and not just on holidays. You get to know a person's history a lot better when you have more time to chat with each other every day. I'm very lucky to have them close by. Many kids my age don't really get to know their grandparents as real people, just as special company. I like hearing my grandpa tell stories about growing up with his younger sister, probably because I have a younger sister too. He told me about the time that he made her play blind man's bluff with him. He blindfolded her and told her where to walk, but then suddenly he thought it would be fun to pull the rug out from under her and make her fall down. But his father saw him do it, and that was not good for him. Even though he did things like that, he loved his sister very much. One time when they were burning trash in their backyard, my Auntie Vi's hair caught on fire. My grandpa jumped and put his coat over her head to put the fire out. Another time when they were at Lake Michigan, they were climbing up some rocks alongside the beach, and she slipped over a big ledge. My grandpa caught her by the hair and pulled her back up. She might have drowned if he hadn't. The reason I decided to share this particular story with you is because I like hearing my grandpa talk about his little sister. Since there are only 2 kids in my family, I'm the older brother of a younger sister just like him. I like hearing about how they argue sometimes. I argue with my sister Hannah sometimes too, but when it comes to saving or defending her, I think I feel a lot like my grandpa did. I would do anything to protect her too.
Hi, I'm Marissa Maroney. I live in Urbana, Illinois. I'm 10 years old and in 5th grade at Leo School. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. Can you imagine keeping a newspaper article for 74 years? Well, I can because my grandma, Helen Castlebaum, did. Grandma and I talk on the telephone almost every Sunday around 9:30. She told me this story one Sunday morning and I wrote it down. Grandma lived in Winfield, Iowa, a small farm community of 800 people in the southeastern corner of the state. Her parents were of German descent. Her father laid drainage tiles, and her mom was a homemaker. She was the second youngest of 5 children, and she walked to the nearby Winfield Consolidated School each day. Her 8th grade teacher, Miss Cotter, was always very generous and was Grandma's favorite. Miss Cotter loved Grandma's class so much, she taught them all the way through high school. Isn't that cool? One day, Miss Cotter asked Grandma if she wanted to enter a writing contest sponsored by the Daughters of the American Revolution. The subject was why the flag was made and what it meant to her. Since she loved writing so much, of course she said yes. Grandma had been writing stories since like the 1st grade, so it all began. Grandma loved reading, and her best friend, Fern, went to the library every Tuesday. So naturally, she went there to do research and gather the information for her paper. It was quite a process. She wrote it, checked it, corrected information, and rewrote it again. Then she presented it to the Miss Cotter to check spelling and punctuation. And finally, Grandma mailed it to the DAR in Washington, D.C. Guess what? She won. And she received a $2.50 gold piece as a prize. Everyone was so proud. Grandma kept on writing in high school and won other contests over the 4 years. But this first one was special. I chose this story because I love to read and write as much as my grandma. I've written stories about our vacations our family has taken together, and also about my brother Luke, who's in the Air Force. Grandma and I also share some favorite books like Black Beauty, National Velvet, and My Friend Flipper. As you can tell, Bill also really loves horses. 2 of Grandma's best friends and her uncle are horses. Sometimes she and a friend would go to her uncle's farm just outside of town and ride around his property. I ride too. I take lessons after school every Thursday at a stable in Champaign, and evented horse shows held in northern Illinois. The difference is that I ride fancy horses, and she rode slower, bigger horses. I enjoy my Sunday talks with Grandma. She kept that article all these years because getting your picture in the paper is a very big deal in a small town. And my grandma's picture and article was on the front page. How fortunate I am to have my grandma join me today. Helen Maroney from Glenview.
Okay, this is the end of our program. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I have a table display here of some of our work, including some of the stories in 8x10 format, stories and photos that you saw on the screen. And Evan, Jesse's brother, has a book that he wrote on life in a one-room schoolhouse in southern Illinois. Is that correct? Okay. So we hope you'll have time to look at the display as well. And thank you very much for coming today.
Are you taking questions now?
Yes, if you'd like to.
Can I ask the kids, the younger people in the the panel that how close were you with your grandparents before you started doing this work? And did you learn more about them than having done this work?
I think I did a lot. Before they moved to Bloomington, they lived in Waukegan, and I saw them once or twice a year on Christmas or Easter. And I got to talk with them quite a bit when they moved to Bloomington, but when my grandfather and I started talking about his younger years, I think I learned a lot about him.
Did you want to answer, either of you? Did you want to answer?
I know I learned a lot more because I didn't even know my grandparents had a candy shop.
I didn't know my grandma was that good of a writer.
Like she said, she didn't know you were that good of a writer.
Any other questions for anybody?
How are you preserving these histories?
My history, my personal history?
When the children are interviewing their grandparents, how are they preserving the history? Are they writing them down in books or what are
Yeah,
they doing?
right. You wrote them down. Okay, why don't you answer that question? Stand up, Jessica.
No, I first for one, I wrote it down, and I'm confident it's gonna be kept in the family box. But family pictures, videos like that. My brother did a similar thing when he wrote his book on my grandma on my mom's side.
He made an actual book that he put together, which is over here on the table. As part of the class.
Just an observation for the children, how lucky they are that they know their grandparents. I never got to know mine. I only see pictures, and now we're trying to retrace our family tree, and it's a hard-going thing. And not to know your grandparents firsthand, I think I've really lost something. And losing my father at a very early age really affected me my entire life. I felt that I was gypped out of a male figure authority. So you kids are very lucky and appreciate us.
I'm probably not going to be able to do this without crying, but because I got teary-eyed when you were saying that my grandparents died, except for my one grandmother, all died before I was born, and the reason that I became a worker in gerontology is because I feel like I missed my grandmother's stories. My grandmother died when I was 16, and I would kind of just half listen to her stories, and I realized as soon as she died, or very shortly after she died, how much I had missed of a slice of history. So I think it's so cool that you guys are doing.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Oh, there was one thing.
Yeah.
When Grandma rode the horse, did you ride bareback?
It was a farm animal horse with a big wide back you could sit on. My sister and I both sat on it, and of course it just went slowly. You know.
Anything else? Yes.
Well, just a big thank you because I work with the intergenerational track here for the conference, and I think you all are the only intergenerational session, truly, where we have the young people listening.
That was the intention. It was my part of my proposal that I actually include young people. Okay. Anybody else? We're happy to. Now, did you want, I don't know how, if you take a break between sessions, if you want to come up and take a look at the pictures for the next session, if you'd like to do that, that would be possible.
Yeah, why don't we take a five?
No, if she walked.
Yeah, if you walk,
Standing still.
yeah, you can't tell the difference,
Missed
you
the
know.
stories about Grandma.
But, and that one girl said something about the holes in her shoes, you put paper in them. That's what I did when I walked to school. I had to walk to school Oh, I hated it in the winter months because it was so wet out, you know what I mean? And my shoes would have big hole in the bottom, but when I leave home to go to school, I would wad up a fold piece of paper, real thick, and put in the bottom of the shoe. Then when I would get to school, I would go into the girls' washroom, you know, and get some of the paper that you dried your hands on and fold it up and stay there like that. And that's how I got through that. I never had boots or anything. And when your great grandfather was his father died when he was little too.
Marissa, nice to meet you. I'm Ceci's mom. I grew up on a farm, and we
go out there thrashing time, you know, and everything.
Sure.
And then one of my classmates, my best girlfriend, she married a farmer. And out there, so after I was married, every summer we'd come back there. Jim would never, no, you were the baby. Pat and his two older brothers would be married. We used to go out there in the summertime. And my husband enjoyed driving the combine because he was a city fellow.
Sure, that's a big thing.
That was a big treat to him, and to go around and feed the pigs and the hogs and all
Sure.
that. They had one cow that was just like a tamed animal, and I have pictures for several years when we would go out there. We would sit the children. They had two girls and I had two boys at that time. They'd sit all four on the cow.
Oh, yeah,
The
and
cow
take
would
the
just
picture.
stand there, yes. It didn't move at all. It
Yeah.
just stand there and let them
Yeah.
sit on it, you know.
They get pretty tame. We've enjoyed meeting Marissa. She's a pretty special girl.
Oh, she certainly is. We had talks every Sunday
That's what
practically
she
over
said.
the phone.
I think that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Nice meeting you.
Yeah.